Behind the soothing sound of falling rain lies the blueprint of a monster. Michael Paton didn't just commit a crime. He engineered a systematic collapse of the human spirit through cold, calculated isolation. Tonight we deconstruct the dark psychology he used to turn a home into a psychological cage. Think about the person who knows you best in this world, not a colleague, not someone you nod to in passing. The person who knows which side of the bed you sleep on, how you take your coffee in the morning, what frightens you when the rest of the world goes quiet at 3 in the morning. The person whose face has become so familiar that you have stopped truly examining it, because familiarity has replaced the instinct to look closely. Now ask yourself something that most people spend their entire lives deliberately avoiding. Do you truly know what lives behind those eyes? Not their habits, not their preferences, not the face they present over dinner, at family gatherings, on the days when everything appears to be running smoothly. Do you know what they hold in the parts of themselves they have never shown you? Do you know what they tell themselves in the silence between the life they are living and the life they believed they were supposed to have? Do you know what a person becomes when the gap between those two things grows wide enough and dark enough and heavy enough to no longer carry without breaking? Most people answer that question automatically. Of course they know. This is their person. This is family. The answer feels obvious, because the alternative is a thought most people are not equipped to sit with for more than a moment before the mind moves away from it. But here is what the record shows. Here is what case after case, investigation after investigation, and courtroom after courtroom has confirmed with painful consistency. The most lethal threats to a family are rarely the ones that arrive from outside. They do not always take the form of a stranger. They do not always come through a broken window in the dark of night. The most dangerous presence inside a home is often the one that was already there, the one that no one examined closely because it had always been there, functioning and calm and entirely ordinary on the surface, right up until the moment when everything that surface had been covering finally came through. That flicker you have felt sometimes, that half second of looking at someone you love and sensing something you cannot name, something that passes through you like a sudden current and disappears before you can reach for it. You dismiss it almost immediately. It feels disloyal. It feels like an invention of your own anxiety. It makes no sense given everything you believe you know about this person. That is not paranoia. That is not the product of an overactive imagination. That is your perception of doing something your logic has not yet caught up to. It is reading the distance between who a person appears to be and what actually lives beneath that appearance. And sometimes that distance is not a small thing. Sometimes that distance is everything. This is a story about that distance. It is the story of a man who built a life that looked, from every angle the outside world had access to, exactly like success. A house in a growing Texas suburb, a wife, 2 children, a mortgage and a driveway, and all the visible, ordinary evidence of a man who had followed the expected path and arrived at the expected destination. Anyone who encountered him without being granted any real access to his interior would have seen nothing worth questioning. He was stable. He was composed. He was, by every external measure, a man who had things under control. Beneath that surface, something had been building for a long time, not in the open, not in scenes that left witnesses behind. It was building quietly, internally, in the sealed space of a man who had invested significant effort in keeping what was accumulating inside him invisible to everyone around him. He carried it without showing it. He maintained the surface without addressing what the surface was covering. The longer that weight stayed sealed inside a life that looked completely intact from the street, the more pressure it created. On a Friday evening in February 2021, that pressure reached the point it could not sustain. A single phone call was placed from a house on the 3100 block of Hickory Lane in Celina, Texas. That call changed that city in ways it has not recovered from. What the caller said in those first moments on the line And what had already taken place inside that house before he reached for the phone is the story you are about to hear. By the time the sun came up on February 20th, 2021, 3 people who had been alive inside that home the night before would never wake again. Hold on to that, because what happened in that house is not simply a crime. It is a lesson in the kind of danger that does not announce itself, the kind that grows in private, in the dark, until it has nowhere left to go. Every person who has ever placed complete trust in another human being needs to understand how something like this takes shape. Before this story moves any further, if you are watching this channel for the first time, welcome to Bedtime Black Files Stories. This is the space where true crime is told with the weight it carries and the seriousness every case deserves. Each story here is grounded in verified, real events. Each story is told not just to inform, but to ensure the lessons inside it reach the people who need them most. If that is the kind of storytelling you have been looking for, subscribe right now and turn on your notifications so this channel never disappears from your feed. And before we go any further into this case, drop one word in the comments below. Just one word. Tell the community what you feel when you hear the name Michael Paton. You do not need to explain it. You do not need to write a full thought. One word is enough. Leave it below and let us see what this community has to say. Now let us go back to Celina, Texas, because before you can understand what happened on the night of February 19th, 2021, you need to understand the world in which it happened. Celina, Texas is not the kind of place you expect to find at the center of a true crime investigation. It does not carry the texture of a city with a long history of violence. It does not have the weight of an urban center where crime has worn grooves into the landscape over decades. Celina is something altogether different. It is a suburb in motion. A place that in the early 2000s was little more than a quiet North Texas town built around a courthouse square, moving at the slow, agricultural pace that had defined that part of the state for generations. The Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex changed that. As the sprawl of one of the largest metropolitan areas in the United States pushed steadily north into Collin County, Celina found itself directly in its path. New developments rose on land that had recently been opened. Neighborhoods with names built to evoke community and belonging began to appear across the landscape. Young families who had spent their early years in apartments closer to the city looked at what Celina offered and found what they had been working toward: affordable houses, promising schools, open streets, and a pace that felt manageable, a distance from the noise of the city. By the time the Paton family arrived on Hickory Lane, the city had grown to roughly 30,000 residents. It was no longer a small town, but it had not yet become the kind of established community where people genuinely knew their neighbors. It existed in that in-between space where a city grows faster than its social bonds can form. The driveways were new. The lawns were recently seeded. The people on either side of your house were people you might wave to from a car window without knowing their last name, without knowing what they did for a living, without knowing whether anything in their lives was not as it appeared from the street. That anonymity was not the product of indifference. It was simply the condition of a suburb building itself faster than the connections between its residents could develop. In older, more established communities, the people around you have accumulated a sense of who you are through years of small, visible moments. They have watched you through seasons, through changes, through the texture of ordinary life that eventually adds up to genuine familiarity. In Celina, during those years, that kind of accumulated knowledge barely existed for most households. People lived in close physical proximity and remained, in the most essential sense, strangers to one another. This detail is not background color. It is the structural context for everything this story is about to reveal. The anonymity of that growing suburb, the way it allowed families to exist side by side without anyone developing a real picture of what was happening inside the houses around them, would become one of the most consequential facts of the Paton case. Not a footnote, a foundation. The house on the 3100 block of Hickory Lane looked like every other house in that part of Celina. 2 stories, a double-car garage, a lawn that communicated, in the visual language of American suburban life, that the people inside cared about the impression the place made from the street, a structure that announced a family lived here, that things were fine, that the ordinary machinery of a life was running the way it was supposed to run. From the street, there was no reason to look any more closely. That was the point. Inside the house on Hickory Lane, the Paton family had made their life. On the surface, the life they had made matched everything the house promised from the outside. There was a wife and a mother. There were 2 children. There was a man who moved through his days with the composure of someone who had nothing to explain. There was, in every outward appearance, a family that had found its footing in the growing city of Celina and was simply getting on with living. What the street could not see was what lived behind the closed door. And in the Paton household, what lived behind the closed door would eventually demand to be seen. Tamara Jo Paton was born in 1984. She was 36 years old at the time of her death. In the coverage of cases like the one that ended her life, victims are often introduced in direct relation to what happened to them. They are defined by the event rather than by the life that preceded it, reduced to their role in a tragedy rather than built as the full human beings they were. This story refuses that approach. Before you hear what was done to Tamara Jo Paton, you are going to know who she was. By every account from those who knew her, Tamara was the kind of person who made the spaces she occupied easier to be in, not through performance, not through a deliberate social strategy, but through the genuine and specific quality of who she was. She carried warmth as a default state. It was not something she switched on for occasions or reserved for people she was trying to impress. It was simply how she moved through the world. She had a laugh that was real in the particular way that genuine laughter is rare, the kind that does not calculate the room before it arrives. That simply comes because something struck her as worth responding to, and there was no reason to withhold it. She had the particular intelligence of someone who had navigated real difficulty without letting that difficulty become the defining fact of her experience. She possessed what might be called practical wisdom, the kind that does not come from books, but from the lived process of learning to keep moving forward when moving forward is the only sensible thing left to do. It was the kind of intelligence that cannot be taught. It had to be earned. She managed a household. She raised 2 children who were approaching the ages where the demands of parenthood shift from the physical to the emotional, where being a mother becomes less about managing logistics and more about being genuinely present in a way that teenagers are not always able to articulate they need. She did this with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had decided that what needed to happen would happen, regardless of whether anyone around her noticed the effort it required. Those who knew her noticed. Even when she did not want them to, they noticed there was something else. Something those closest to Tamara were aware of even when it went unnamed. It was not anything she announced. She was not a woman who laid her difficulties openly before the people in her life and asked them to hold the weight of it with her. But in the margins of ordinary conversations, in the pauses between things, there was sometimes a heaviness around her that those who cared about her could sense without being able to directly access. A weight that was not entirely her own to carry, but that she had taken on anyway because the situation required it, and because she was a woman who did what situations required. The people who loved her could feel that weight. They could not always reach it, because Tamara kept the interior of her life private, in the way people keep things private when they have learned that full transparency is not always possible, or safe, or worth the cost of what it brings. She managed. She kept the household running. She kept herself running. In the space between what was visible and what was being carried beneath it, she continued to be the person who held the family together. That is who Tamara Jo Paton was. Not a name on a charge sheet. Not simply a wife. Not simply a mother. Not simply a victim whose story exists only in relation to what was done to her. She was a woman with an interior life that mattered, with relationships that were real, with a future that should have contained decades more of the specific, irreplaceable person she was. She deserved to watch her children move through the world. She deserved the days that come after the hard ones, the relationships that deepen with time, the version of herself that was still in the process of becoming at 36. She deserved to live. The house on Hickory Lane was supposed to be the place where that life continued. It was supposed to be the foundation beneath everything still ahead of her. Instead, it became the place where everything Tamara Jo Paton was, and everything she was going to be, came to an end. On a February evening that no one around her saw coming. She was 36 years old. She is the first person this story owes its full honesty to. The two children who lived on Hickory Lane were not abstractions. They were not symbols of innocence placed into a narrative to generate emotional weight. They were specific people at specific ages. And those ages matter because 14 and 13 are not interchangeable with any other point in a human life. They carry a particular texture. They hold a quality of experience that belongs only to that window of time. And that quality deserves to be named before this story moves any further. Kyndle Paton was 14 years old. If you have been 14, or if you have watched someone you love move through that age, you know something about what it feels like from the inside. It is the age where the world begins to come into sharper focus, and that sharpness comes with a cost. It is the age of friendships that feel more significant than anything that came before them, of a social world that is more complex and more consequential than the one that existed even a year earlier. It is the age where the first real outlines of the adult you are going to start to become visible, not fully formed, not permanent yet, but present, beginning. Kyndle was navigating all of that. She was moving through high school in the particular way a girl her age moves through it when the world is still making itself legible to her, when she is still developing the language for the life ahead. She was forming the first real foundations of who she was going to be. She was accumulating the experiences that would eventually add up to a history. She had no awareness, in the way that 14-year-olds never have any awareness, that the future is not a guarantee. She was simply living inside it, the way people that age are supposed to live. Evan Paton was 13, 1 year younger than his sister, and within that 1 year, a meaningful difference in terms of where a person stands on the path from childhood into what follows. Evan was still at the threshold, old enough to understand the general shape of the world, young enough to still be mostly unformed by it. 13 is the age where a boy begins to develop the first real outlines of the person he will carry through the rest of his life, the interests that will become defining, the habits of thought that will slowly solidify into character, the sense of self that is at 13, still largely open, still largely possible, still mostly ahead of him. He had barely begun. Both children lived in the house on Hickory Lane with a particular quality of trust that children place in the safety of their home. They had no reason to question the structure of the life they had been given. There was a mother who was present and warm. There was a father who, on the surface, appeared to function as a father was supposed to function. They were teenagers in a suburb north of Dallas, living inside the ordinary rhythms of school and home, and the gradual, uneven process of discovering who they were. Nothing in their daily experience suggested that the ground beneath their lives was anything other than solid. That trust was not naive. It was not a failure of perception or judgment. It was simply the natural condition of being a child inside a home that appeared, from every angle available to them, to be what a home is supposed to be. Their trust in that structure was the most understandable thing in the world. It was also the thing that made them most completely vulnerable to the danger living inside that structure alongside them. Kyndle Paton was 14. Evan Paton was 13. Every year that should have come after those ages was taken from them. Michael Patrick Paton was born in 1983. He was 37 years old on the night of February 19th, 2021, which means that the life he had spent nearly 4 decades constructing, the image he had built, the household he had assembled, The composed and unremarkable exterior he had maintained through considerable internal effort collapsed in a single evening. But before it collapsed, it held. And the way it held is important, because it is the thing that makes Michael Paton genuinely resistant to the easy categorizations that people reach for when they hear that a man killed his own family. He did not look like what most people expect. He was not the person who made scenes. He was not the husband who screamed at his wife in public. He was not the father that neighbors recalled watching with mounting unease. Not the man anyone in Celina had a visible and documented reason to worry about. He was composed. He was functional. He was, in the social language of the neighborhood, unremarkable. And he was unremarkable not simply because he was a quiet person by temperament, but because being unremarkable was something he had worked at. It was not an accident of personality. It was a project, and he maintained it with quiet, consistent effort. Michael Paton was a man who had organized his entire sense of self around one central thing: the maintenance of an image, not an extravagant image, not the image of wealth or prominence or visible achievement, something quieter and more fundamental than those things: the image of a man who was stable, capable, in control, a man who had his household in order, in the most literal sense of that phrase, and who could meet any external standard of what a husband and father was supposed to be. That image was his architecture. Everything he did in terms of how he managed the family's social exposure, how he kept the household's inner workings private, how he maintained careful distance between his family and anyone who might have developed a clear enough view of what was actually happening inside, served that architecture. He was not building a life. He was building a version of a life that would hold up under the level of scrutiny he permitted, which was not much scrutiny at all. Neighbors on Hickory Lane would later recall that the Patons were not a family that participated in the rhythm of the community around them. They were not at neighborhood gatherings. Their children were not part of the loose, informal networks that form between families who have been in proximity long enough to know one another. They kept to themselves. They occupied their property and moved through their days without meaningful contact with the people immediately surrounding them. At the time, this registered as nothing more than a preference for privacy. People lead private lives. Families choose how much of themselves to share with the world around them. Looking back, that absence of connection was the most important detail about them. Because Michael Paton understood, on a level that may not have been fully conscious but was thoroughly operational, that visibility and control are incompatible with each other. The more people who had a clear picture of the Paton household, the more people who might notice when that picture changed. The fewer people granted access to the interior of his life, the fewer people positioned to raise a question at the precise moment a question most needed to be raised. He kept his world deliberately small, because a small world is a manageable world, and the management of the world around him was something he attended to with the same quiet consistency with which he attended to everything else. What he could not manage was what was building inside him. That is the exact point on which this entire story turns. It is the detail that the next part of this narrative will examine in full, because what investigators and prosecutors would eventually establish is that by the time February 2021 arrived, Michael Paton was not the man his exterior promised. He was a man whose interior had been deteriorating for an extended period of time. Quietly and without interruption, behind the composed surface he continued to present to the world around him. He was the man who managed everything, except for himself. And the night that management finally failed is a night that Celina, Texas has been living with ever since. The house on Hickory Lane told you what Michael Paton needed it to tell you. From the driveway, from the street, from every angle available to anyone who had not been granted access to what lived behind the front door, it communicated stability, function, a household running the way a household was supposed to run. 2 stories, a double-car garage, the ordinary evidence of a life that was making its payments and fulfilling its obligations and moving through its days on schedule. What it did not communicate was the marriage. The marriage between Michael Patrick Paton and Tamara Jo Paton. had been carrying a fracture for an extended period of time before February 2021 arrived. Not a clean, visible break, not the kind of rupture that produces scenes in public, that leaves observable evidence in the memories of people who knew them. The kind of fracture that forms gradually inside a structure that continues to hold its shape on the outside, that develops its pressure in private, that nobody sees until the weight above it finally becomes more than the surface can sustain. What the investigative record assembled by the Celina Police Department's Criminal Investigation Division and the Collin County District Attorney's Office established in the months following the murders was a marriage under genuine and compounding strain. Part of that strain was financial. The Paton household carried the obligations of its lifestyle: a mortgage on a 2-story suburban home, 2 teenagers moving through the stage of life where the costs of raising children shift and accumulate in new ways, car payments, and the steady, unremarkable weight of a middle-class life in a growing Texas suburb. None of these pressures were, in isolation, extraordinary. Families across Collin County were carrying the same load in the same period. The difference was the man. Michael Paton was constitutionally incapable of receiving financial difficulty as a shared problem. He could not put it on the table between himself and Tamara and say, in any honest or vulnerable form, that things were hard and that they needed to navigate the hardness together. That kind of transparency required a willingness to be seen as something less than fully in command of the life he had built. And being fully in command was not a feature of his identity, it was the foundation of it. The entire structure of who he believed he was rested on his uninterrupted performance of capability. Financial difficulty was not a season to move through. It was evidence against the person he had spent his life performing. And a man whose sense of self cannot absorb that kind of evidence without fracturing does not address the difficulty honestly. He buries it. He buried it. He carried it in the sealed interior he had always kept sealed, without acknowledgement, without the kind of communication that would have required him to admit that anything in his control had slipped. Tamara was living in the same house, and inhabiting a fundamentally different version of its reality. She was perceptive in the way that women who carry households become perceptive, attuned to shifts and changes in the emotional atmosphere around them. She knew that something in the space between them had altered. The weight between them was different. The distance, measured not in physical space, but in what they were or were not genuinely sharing with each other, had grown. But the full interior of what was consuming Michael Paton was not available to her. He had arranged it that way. The management of what Tamara could see and know about his interior state was part of the same project as the management of what the neighborhood could see and know about the household. The less that could be examined, the safer the image. The more that remained private, the more control he retained over the version of himself that existed in the world. By the period preceding February 2021, the investigative record indicates the marriage had traveled past the point at which ordinary difficulty could account for what was between them. Whether formal conversations about separation had taken place, or whether what had grown between Michael and Tamara was the particular silence of a marriage where the most important things are no longer being spoken. The partnership had reached a breaking point, and for a man who had built his entire sense of self around the continuation of his role as husband and head of household, that breaking point was not simply the end of a relationship. In his psychology, it was the end of the only self he had ever assembled. Criminologists and forensic psychologists who study violent crime have documented a recognizable profile within the broader category of domestic homicide. They call it the family annihilator. The term is clinical in its construction, but the reality it describes is anything but abstract. It describes a man who kills the members of his own household, typically a wife and children, in a single concentrated event. And it describes a set of characteristics, consistent enough across a sufficient number of documented cases to constitute a genuine pattern, that help explain how such an event becomes possible. Michael Paton fits that pattern, not because the pattern excuses him, not because it reduces his responsibility by a single fraction. It fits because the pattern is real, and because the only purpose in naming it here is to give the people watching this story something they can carry forward. The ability to recognize what this profile looks like before a family annihilation becomes the only thing left to recognize. The family annihilator is almost always male. He is almost always occupying the role of husband and father. He is almost always a man who has built his sense of self entirely around his position as the functional authority of his household, as the provider, the protector, the person whose capability defines his value in his own mind, and he believes in the minds of everyone around him. This identity is not designed to absorb failure. It has no flex. It carries no mechanism for the honest acknowledgement of inadequacy, for the ordinary human experience of a life that develops in directions its occupant did not plan for or cannot control. When external circumstances begin to apply pressure to that identity, whether through financial collapse, marital deterioration, professional failure, or any other force that creates a gap between the life he expected to maintain and the life he is actually living, the family annihilator does not adapt. He does not reach outward for support. He does not allow himself to be seen in the vulnerability of an honest crisis, because vulnerability and the performance of control are incompatible, and control is the only currency his self-image accepts. He holds on instead. He holds on past the point at which any rational external perspective would recognize that holding on is no longer a viable strategy. He holds on because releasing the grip means, in the closed logic of his psychology, not a difficult transition but a complete erasure, the dissolution of the marriage, the loss of the household, the visible evidence of a life that has not held together the way he needed it to hold, represents to him not a chapter ending, but an annihilation of the self he has spent years constructing. And a man who cannot tolerate that prospect, who has no internal resources for processing it, and has deliberately dismantled every external resource that might have helped him, will reach toward options that, from the outside, no coherent human being should be able to reach. What makes this profile so resistant to early identification is the exact mechanism that makes it so dangerous. The compulsive management of image that defines the family annihilator also keeps his deterioration invisible. He does not broadcast his internal collapse. He does not give the people around him visible, documentable, externally legible reasons for alarm. He maintains the surface precisely because maintaining the surface is the project that has always defined him. He is most composed in public in the period when he is most dangerously destabilized in private, and the two things reinforce each other in ways that make external detection extraordinarily difficult. The family, in the psychological reality of a man who has reached this stage, has ceased to be a collection of people he loves. It has been reframed in the distorted internal logic his deterioration has produced as the living evidence of his failure. Each person under that roof represents in his thinking a witness to what he could not maintain, and in the catastrophic reasoning of a man whose mind has arrived at this point, removing the witnesses becomes conflated with removing the failure they represent. This is not sanity. It is not a rational process, but it is a recognizable process, and it follows a consistent internal sequence in enough documented cases to confirm that it is not random. It is the product of a specific kind of man, in a specific kind of crisis, who has been allowed to deteriorate to a specific kind of breaking point without interruption, understanding that sequence is not sympathy for the man at the center of it. It is the only tool available for seeing the next one before it reaches its conclusion. Here is the detail that needs to stop you completely. Michael Paton never raised his voice at Tamara Jo Paton in front of anyone who could later report it. He never disrupted a school event, never created a scene in a grocery store, never gave a neighbor, a colleague, or a passing acquaintance a single observable, external reason to think that anything inside the Paton household was moving in a dangerous direction. Not one incident, not one moment that anyone outside that front door could point to and say that they had seen something that worried them. The invisibility of what was building was not a byproduct of his temperament. It was produced. It was maintained with the same quiet discipline that maintained every other dimension of the image he had spent years protecting. The danger inside the Paton household was invisible, because Michael Paton had worked to keep it that way, and because the tools he used to keep it invisible were the same tools he had always used to manage everything else about his life. Have you ever looked back at a situation and realized only in retrospect that something serious had been happening for a long time before it became visible? A relationship in your life that appeared from the outside to be functioning, and that you later understood had been in profound difficulty for far longer than anyone around it had known. A person who carried a crisis so privately, so thoroughly concealed beneath an ordinary surface, that when it finally broke through, everyone who thought they knew them had to revise everything they believed they had been seeing. Most people can step into that question and find something true inside it. The gap between surfaces and what surfaces cover is one of the most common human experiences, and it is almost never named while it is active. It almost always requires the benefit of hindsight to become legible. That is the structural problem at the center of this case. A man in psychological freefall had built an environment, a household, a social reality, in which no one was positioned to see him clearly enough to intervene. There was no one with the relational access to notice the change in his interior. No one with the standing to ask a question that might have introduced a different direction into the sequence that was building. No friend positioned closely enough. No family member is present regularly enough. No community anchor with the kind of earned, sustained access that genuine connection required. He had built a world without the possibility of interruption, and a crisis that cannot be interrupted does not resolve itself. What that crisis looked and sounded like when it finally reached the moment from which there was no returning is the story's part 3 will carry. But first, you need to understand the final structural piece of how he was able to arrive at that moment unseen. Because the isolation that made this crime possible was not simply a feature of one man's personality. It was a condition that a community produced around him, and that he then used with devastating precision. Latona Witt was a neighbor. She occupied the kind of geographic proximity to the Paton household that, in theory, positioned her to observe things about the family that people further away could not. In practice, what she observed was primarily their absence. The Patons were not a presence in the life of the neighborhood around them. They did not participate in the informal rhythms of community that develop between families who share a street over time. They were there in the physical sense of occupying a house on the block, and they were largely not there in any other sense that mattered. When the murders became known, and Latona Witt spoke about what she had observed, her words entered the record of this case as something more than a neighbor's reflection. She said that what happened on February 19 had not simply happened that day. It had led up to that night. She said that what the tragedy taught her was the need for communities to be more aware of the people living around them, to make genuine efforts to connect, because a person struggling in isolation, as she framed it, might have reached out to someone if that someone had been close enough to reach. He could have been more connected, she said, and had someone to turn to in a struggling moment, rather than being isolated when the tragedy arrived. Her words were not a redistribution of blame. She was not suggesting that the neighborhood was responsible for what Michael Paton chose to do. The responsibility for those choices belongs without qualification or dilution to Michael Paton. What she was identifying, with the clarity that only proximity and hindsight together can produce, was the structural reality that isolation creates. When the people immediately surrounding a household have no genuine relationship with the people inside it, the household becomes, in the most consequential possible sense, a sealed system. Whatever builds inside a sealed system stays inside it. Nothing enters from outside to interrupt it. No question, no presence, No relationship offers a channel through which what is building can be reached before it becomes unreachable. The isolation operating in the Paton case moved on two distinct levels, and they did not simply coexist, they multiplied each other. The first level was structural and geographic. Celina's rate of growth in the years leading up to 2021 had produced a city of neighbors who were, beneath the surface of shared streets and adjacent driveways, largely strangers. The community had not had time to accumulate the kind of layered, sustained familiarity that older neighborhoods carry. In an established community, the people around you have observed you across seasons, across changes, across the ordinary and irregular events of a life lived in public proximity. They have built, through years of small, visible moments, a genuine picture of who you are and what your household looks and feels like under normal conditions. They notice when that picture changes. On the streets of Celina in those years of rapid development, that accumulated picture did not exist for most households. Families had arrived in proximity to each other without the shared history that converts adjacency into genuine knowledge. The default condition was not community, but co-location. People living near enough to wave from a driveway, too recently arrived to know each other in any way that would have registered a change. The second level was deliberate. Michael Paton had not simply been carried along by the anonymity that Celina's growth provided. He had actively sustained it. He had kept the family's social circle narrow and their community involvement minimal, not through dramatic action, not through any observable strategy that could have been named and questioned, but through the consistent low-level management of how much access to his household he permitted. No neighbor established enough of a regular relationship with the Patons to notice if the atmosphere inside the house had changed. No extended family member maintained enough presence in the household to read what the texture of daily life in that house actually felt like. No community relationship existed through which Tamara Jo Paton could have found an outlet, or through which any person with genuine access might have developed enough of a picture to say that something needed attention. This was not passive. It was consistent with the same principle that governed every other dimension of his behavior. External visibility was incompatible with internal control, and control was the thing he would not sacrifice. By ensuring the household remained unknown to the community around it, he ensured that his interior deterioration had no external contact. The crisis building inside Michael Paton moved through its stages without any point of genuine exposure to the outside world. The two levels of isolation, Celina's structural anonymity and Michael Paton's deliberate management of his household's social exposure, amplified each other until the Paton family existed in a condition of effective invisibility, even to the people living immediately beside them. Latona Witt could sense in retrospect that something had been building in that house. She could feel, looking back, that the weight of it had been there, but there had been no foundation of genuine connection between her and the household next door, through which that sense could have become a question. No channel through which a question could have become a conversation. No relationship through which a conversation could have become any kind of intervention. What genuine community connection provides is not a guarantee against violence. It does not eliminate the conditions that produce a man like Michael Paton. What it provides is the possibility of visibility, the possibility that a person in a deteriorating crisis is not completely sealed from the outside world, the possibility that someone, somewhere in the social environment of a struggling household, has enough real access to notice that something is wrong and enough relational standing to say so. That possibility did not exist on Hickory Lane, and its absence is not a detail. It is one of the most consequential structural facts of this entire case. In the months between the point at which the Paton marriage crossed the threshold from which it would not return, and the evening of February 19th, 2021, the house on Hickory Lane was still standing. The exterior still communicated what Michael Paton needed it to communicate. The cars were in the driveway. The lawn held its shape. The daily rhythm of a household continued to produce the outward appearance of function. But inside, the investigative record established Something was accelerating. The digital records that the Celina Police Department's Criminal Investigation Division examined in the months following the murders told a story that the exterior of the Paton household had been specifically designed to prevent anyone from reading. Financial records, subpoenaed and analyzed as part of the capital murder investigation, added further dimension to a picture of a man whose interior state had been compounding in a single direction without any external point of contact or interruption. What investigators were reconstructing was not a sudden event with a sudden cause. It was a progression, a sequence of internal stages, each one moving further from any possibility of organic resolution, each one adding weight to what was already past the point of being addressed through ordinary means. The digital footprint Michael Paton left in the months before February did not suggest a man under the kind of manageable stress that most people move through in the course of demanding lives. It suggested a man in genuine psychological crisis, a crisis that had been sealed inside a household with no external contact, no outlet, and no interruption, long enough to compound beyond what any internal process of self-correction could reach. The household itself changed in the way that households in this condition change, not through visible dramatic events, but through the specific quality of what was no longer present. Communication between two people who are no longer communicating honestly produces a particular kind of quiet that is different from comfortable silence. It is the quiet of things that needed to be said and were not being said. It is the quiet of a growing distance between two people still technically sharing the same rooms. It carries weight, it has a direction, and in the months before February 2021, that weight and that direction were moving without anything to slow them. Tamara Jo Paton was aware, to the extent that she had access to the situation, that something beneath the household had fundamentally changed. She had the specific perceptiveness of a woman who had been paying careful attention to the interior of that household for years, and she could feel that what she was living in had shifted in ways that were not explained by any ordinary seasonal difficulty. What she did not have, because Michael Paton had deliberately ensured she could not have it, was the complete picture of the state he was in, and the direction that state was moving. By the time February arrived, the investigative record indicates he had moved past the stages at which any internal process of self-correction was available to him. Whatever had existed between the state he was in and the decision he reached was gone. The household surface held. The exterior remained intact. The street saw nothing that required a second glance. And behind that surface, in the sealed interior of a man who had spent his entire adult life making certain that no one could see what was happening inside him, the last thing that had been holding was no longer holding. The evening of February 19th, 2021, was not the beginning of what happened in that house. It was the end of a long and private process that had moved through every stage available to it, without a single point of external contact. The clock is now where this story needs it to be. Before this story takes you into that night, stop for a moment. Does anything in what you have just heard feel familiar in any way? Not in the extremity of this case, but somewhere in the smaller and more ordinary version of these conditions. A household that projected stability while something else was happening inside it. A person who carried something serious entirely out of sight. A community too thinly connected to notice what was building one door down. If any part of that lands somewhere real for you, share it in the comments below. This community is built on honest conversation, and honest conversation about what these stories reveal is part of what gives them their value. If this story is reaching you, if the weight of it is doing what it is supposed to do, hit the like button, not as a favor to the channel, as an acknowledgement of Tamara Jo Paton, Kyndle Paton, and Evan Paton, three people whose story deserves to be carried as far as it can go. The time is now 7:20 p.m. on February 19th, 2021. Michael Paton is outside the house on Hickory Lane. He has a phone in one hand and a gun in the other. At 7:20 p.m., On February 19, 2021, a 911 dispatcher in Celina, Texas, answered a call. What came through the line in the first seconds of that call was not screaming. It was not the fractured, hyperventilating voice of someone who had encountered a horror they had not been prepared for. It was not the sound of a person in shock discovering something terrible. It was flat, controlled, delivered with the particular quality of a man who had already been somewhere for a long time before he picked up the phone to report where he was. I just killed my whole family. 7 words, past tense. No hesitation before them. No audible collapse after them. The admission arrived in the conversation the way a statement of fact arrives. The way a person reports something that has already fully occurred and is no longer in any dimension of uncertainty. There was no question in his voice. There was no wavering. He said what he said, and then he continued talking. And the combination of those two things, the completeness of the admission and the composure with which it was delivered, tells you something essential about the state Michael Paton was in at the moment he made that call. He told the dispatcher that he had shot his wife. He said there was a fire in the master bedroom. He said his 2 children were in the house. He said he was standing outside with a gun still in his hand. Then the call began to produce its contradictions. When the dispatcher pressed him on the children, where they were, whether they were alive, whether he had checked on them, Michael Paton said he had called for them, and they had not come. He said he did not know where they were in the house. He told the dispatcher that Tamara Jo Paton was in the closet and was not breathing. And then, in the same conversation in which he had opened, by saying he had killed his whole family in the past tense with full declarative clarity, he told the dispatcher something that sat in direct opposition to everything his opening statement had already established. He said he had woken up and found them dead. He said the gun was in his hand when he came to. He said he was not entirely certain how any of the events he was reporting had come to pass. Hold those two things side by side. A man who opens a 911 call by stating in the past tense with complete composure that he has killed his entire family, and the same man, in the same call, telling the dispatcher that he woke up to find them dead and could not account for how the gun ended up in his hand. These are not the statements of a person reconstructing a fragmentary and traumatic memory. They are the statements of a man doing 2 things simultaneously. The first is reporting what he has done, because the call itself required reporting. The second is attempting, in real time, to introduce a secondary narrative into the evidentiary record being created by the call. The waking up claim is not confusion, it is construction. It is the attempt of a man whose entire adult life had been organized around the management of what others could see and verify, reaching, even at the moment of his own confession, for one final layer of managed ambiguity. The forensic evidence would eliminate that attempt entirely. The manner in which each victim died, the locations of the bodies within the house, the sequential and targeted nature of the 3 shootings, the fire set deliberately in the master bedroom where Tamara Jo Paton's body was found. None of it was consistent with a man who had woken up disoriented to discover a scene he had not consciously produced. Every element of the physical evidence at 3100 Hickory Lane pointed in a single, unambiguous direction. What Michael Paton described as possible unconscious action was, in the verified physical record, a deliberate and sequential series of choices, each victim in a specific location, each shot placed. The fire started with the intent that the starting of it communicated. What the waking up claim reveals is not a man with a genuine memory gap. It is the last observable expression of the controlling personality that part of this story established in full. A man who had spent his entire adult life managing narratives, managing images, managing the story available to anyone looking at him from the outside, could not stop doing that, even when the story being created was the record of his own capital crime. Even in confession, he was still trying to manage. Even with the gun in his hand and 3 people dead in the house behind him, the instinct to control what could be verified about him was still operational. That instinct and the 911 call that documented it served as both a confession and a psychological document. Investigators in the months that followed would treat it as both. Its value to the prosecution was not only what it confirmed about the events of February 19, it was what it confirmed about the man who had produced those events. The 911 call has been examined in full. It will not be returned to again. What it set in motion on the night of February 19 is what this narrative of the story carries forward. While Michael Paton was still on the phone with the dispatcher, the Celina Police Department was already moving toward Hickory Lane. Officers were dispatched immediately upon receipt of the call, and while they were en route, a second call came in from the same address. The house was on fire. The Celina Fire Department was dispatched. Both agencies, law enforcement and fire response, converged on the 3,100 block of Hickory Lane within minutes of each other, each arriving to a scene that was already fully formed in its catastrophe. The house was burning. The fire had taken hold in the master bedroom and was moving, and standing outside in the space between the burning structure and the street was Michael Patrick Paton. Sergeant Jeremiah Phillips was among the responding officers. What he and his colleagues encountered when they arrived was a man who was not running, not hiding, not constructing any physical distance between himself and the scene of what he had reported. Michael Paton was there, visible outside the house, with the gun still accessible on his person. When Sergeant Jeremiah Phillips approached, Michael Paton placed the weapon in the bed of his pickup truck. He did this without being instructed to. He did this before any direct order requiring it was issued. He placed it there, and then he allowed himself to be detained, offering no resistance, no physical confrontation, no attempt to change the situation in any direction. The absence of struggle at that moment is something that requires its own examination, because it communicates something about where Michael Paton was by the time Sergeant Jeremiah Phillips reached him. A man who runs is a man who still believes there is something outside the moment he is in that is worth reaching for. A man who resists is a man whose investment in a different outcome has not fully collapsed. Michael Paton did neither. He placed the gun in the truck bed. He stood. He waited. There was no version of the situation from which he was trying to escape, because the situation, in his psychology, was already concluded. Whatever the act of the preceding hours had been for him internally, by the time he was standing in that yard, it was finished. The crisis had reached its terminal point. There was nothing left in his interior that was still organized around avoidance. That stillness, that complete absence of flight or resistance, told the arriving officers something before any formal investigation had begun. It told them that the man in front of them had not stumbled into the scene he was reporting. He had produced it, and had then waited for the consequence of having produced it. Sergeant Jeremiah Phillips detained Michael Paton. He was taken into custody at the scene without incident. Inside the burning structure, Celina firefighters moved through the conditions the fire had created, working quickly to bring it under control before it consumed the building entirely. The fire originated in the master bedroom. That point of origin was confirmed, and would become a critical element of the forensic analysis in the investigation that followed. The fire was not incidental. It was not the byproduct of an accidental spark or a neglected appliance. It was set. It was set in the room where Tamara Jo Paton's body would be found. When firefighters located her, she was in the closet of the master bedroom, exactly where Michael Paton had told the dispatcher she would be. She was not breathing. She had sustained a gunshot wound. She was 36 years old. Kyndle Paton and Evan Paton were found elsewhere in the house. Kyndle was 14. Evan was 13. Both had sustained gunshot wounds. Both were gone. 3 bodies were recovered from 3,100 Hickory Lane on the night of February 19, 2021. An adult woman and 2 children, Tamara Jo Paton, Kyndle Paton, and Evan Paton, each of them shot. Each of them in the house they had lived in, trusted, and moved through as a home. The fire was contained, the structure held, and the house on Hickory Lane, which had spent years presenting to the street exactly the image Michael Paton needed it to present, now stood as a crime scene. Crime scenes tell their stories in physical language, not in the language of testimony, not in the language of motive or psychology or the interior life of the person who produced them, in the arrangement of objects, in the location of bodies, in the patterns that forensic analysis can read from the evidence left behind by a sequence of events. And the crime scene at 3100 Hickory Lane told a story whose meaning was not ambiguous. The three victims had not been killed in the same location. They had been found in separate areas of the house. Tamara Jo Paton was in the master bedroom closet. Kyndle Paton and Evan Paton were in different spaces within the structure. The distribution of the victims across the house was not consistent with a single confrontational event, with a chaotic eruption in one location that produced all three deaths. It was consistent with something deliberate, with a sequence that moved through the house with specific intent, that produced each death at a specific location, that was organized around the individual targeting of each person separately. This was not one act, it was three. The fire that had been set in the master bedroom was examined by the Celina Fire Department as part of the multi-agency response that the case required from its first night. The origin and cause analysis confirmed what the physical evidence had already suggested. The fire did not start by accident. It was not a secondary consequence of events that had nothing to do with intent. It was set deliberately. In the room where Tamara Jo Paton's body was located, the fire had been designed to do something to that room and to the evidence within it. Whether its purpose was to complicate the forensic reconstruction of events, or to serve some other function within Michael Paton's internal logic on that night, it was a calculated act, another choice in a sequence of choices. The murder weapon was recovered. Michael Paton had placed it in the bed of his pickup truck upon the arrival of law enforcement, which meant it had remained in his possession from the point at which the killings occurred through the period of his 911 call and through the minutes before Sergeant Jeremiah Phillips reached him. That weapon was taken into evidence and subjected to ballistic analysis. The analysis tied it directly to the deaths of Tamara Jo Paton, Kyndle Paton, and Evan Paton. The forensic pathology conducted on all three victims confirmed the cause of death across each case: gunshot wounds. The fire, whatever Michael Paton had intended it to accomplish, had not obscured the fundamental medical and forensic truth of how each member of his family had died. Michael Paton was transported from the scene to the Collin County Jail that night. The charge filed against him was capital murder of multiple persons, the most severe criminal charge available under Texas law. His bond was set at $1.5 million. The legal machinery that would eventually deliver accountability for what had happened at 3100 Hickory Lane was now in motion. The evidence gathered from the crime scene on the night of February 19th and in the immediate investigative period that followed established two things that the prosecution would need to carry forward. First, that each of the three deaths was deliberate, not accidental, not the product of a single uncontrolled moment, but the result of three separate and targeted acts. Second, that the fire was itself an intentional criminal act, an attempt to alter the physical record of a crime scene, in a case where the perpetrator was already in custody and had already, in his own words, confirmed what had happened. Both of those things were established. Neither of them was going to become uncertain. What remained was the work of building a case thorough enough to match the weight of what had occurred. The question of guilt in the Paton case was not one that investigation needed to resolve. Michael Paton had called 911 and told the dispatcher he had killed his entire family. He was standing outside the house when officers arrived. He had the weapon in his possession and placed it in the truck bed of his own accord. He was detained at the scene The identity of the perpetrator was not a puzzle that the criminal investigation needed to solve. What the investigation needed to do was something more specific and more consequential than identifying who was responsible. It needed to construct a case thorough enough to withstand every legal challenge available to the defense, thorough enough to eliminate every possible argument that could be raised at trial, and thorough enough to deliver an outcome that the family of Tamara Jo Paton, Kyndle Paton, and Evan Paton could receive as unassailable accountability. In a capital murder case involving 3 victims, thoroughness is not a preference. It is the standard to which the prosecution is held, and the standard to which the victims are owed. The Celina Police Department described what followed as a long investigation requiring relentless effort. That description was accurate. The Criminal Investigation Division of the Celina Police Department, working in coordination with the Collin County District Attorney's Office and investigator Robert Lawhon, built the evidentiary structure of the case across the 21 months between the night of the murders and the formal legal resolution that November 2022 produced. Digital forensics formed one pillar of that structure. The electronic records accessible to investigators, phone records, communications, and any digital footprint that could illuminate the state of the Paton household and the state of Michael Paton's interior life in the period leading up to February 19, were examined with the kind of methodical attention that capital murder investigations require. Digital evidence in cases of domestic homicide frequently reveals the internal timeline of a deteriorating situation in ways that physical evidence alone cannot. It establishes sequence. It establishes premeditation. It fills in the spaces between the visible events of a crime and the invisible process that produced them. Financial records were subpoenaed. The complete picture of the Paton household's economic condition, the obligations it was carrying, the pressures that the investigative record had identified as one of them. Compounding stresses in Michael Paton's deteriorating interior state was laid out in the evidentiary record through documentation that could not be disputed or reinterpreted. Witness interviews were conducted with everyone who had maintained any form of meaningful contact with the Paton family in the months preceding the murder. Neighbors, extended family members, anyone whose observations could contribute to the reconstruction of the household's trajectory in the period before February 19. These interviews produced the human dimension of the investigative record, the texture of lived proximity to the Paton household that documentary evidence alone could not supply. The Celina Fire Department's analysis of the fire's origin and cause served as a distinct and critical element of the evidentiary structure. The confirmation that the fire had been deliberately set, that its origin in the master bedroom was not accidental, added the charge of arson to the physical record of what Michael Paton had done on the night of February 19. It established that the fire was not a secondary consequence of the killings, but a third deliberate act, a calculated attempt to introduce forensic interference into a crime scene in which he was already the identified perpetrator. The arson finding closed off any defense argument that the fire's origin, or the evidence it had affected, might have been subject to alternative interpretation. The 911 call was catalogued by investigators as a document within the evidentiary record, a formal piece of evidence among the many that the prosecution assembled across 21 months. Its evidentiary function within the investigation was precisely what the record of a self-incriminating call in a capital murder case is expected to serve. The ballistic analysis of the recovered weapon, the forensic pathology reports on all 3 victims, the crime scene reconstruction, the digital record, the financial documentation, and the fire investigation findings were assembled by the prosecution team into a case whose evidentiary foundation was, by November 2022, comprehensive enough to sustain the weight of a capital murder charge involving 3 victims and a perpetrator facing the most serious criminal penalties available under Texas law. Robin Lawhon, the Collin County District Attorney's Office investigator assigned to the case, contributed the prosecutorial analytical work that connected the investigative record to the legal architecture required for the charges filed. The Celina Police Department's Patrol Division, which had responded to the scene on the night of February 19th and had detained Michael Paton without incident, contributed the procedural foundation on which the entire investigation rested. The Celina Fire Department's findings completed the multi-agency evidentiary structure. 21 months is a long time in the life of a family waiting for accountability. For the family of Tamara Jo Paton, those months carry the particular weight of grief, compounded by the knowledge that the man responsible for 3 deaths was alive, housed, and moving through the legal process at the pace that process demands. The length of that wait was not the product of uncertainty about who was responsible or what he had done. It was the product of investigators and prosecutors honoring their obligation to the victims by building a case from which no responsible legal challenge could extract a meaningful concession. The family of Tamara Jo Paton, Kyndle Paton, and Evan Paton deserved nothing less than that. By November 2022, the case was ready. Before this story delivers its final part of the story, take a moment and sit with what you have just heard. 3 people were shot inside their own home. A fire was set to follow. A man stood in the yard with the weapon and waited for the consequence of what he had done. And for 21 months, a team of investigators and prosecutors built the accountability that those 3 people deserved. What do you think justice should look like in a case like this one? What does a life sentence mean to you when you set it against what was taken from Tamara Jo Paton, Kyndle Paton, and Evan Paton? Drop your answer in the comments below. This is a genuine question and a space for genuine conversation. Your perspective matters here. If someone in your life needs to hear this story, share this video with them right now, not as a favor to this channel, as an act of awareness. Someone watching this alongside you might recognize something in it that changes how they see a situation in their own world. And if you are not yet subscribed to Bedtime Black File Stories, now is the time. Hit that button and stay connected to every story this channel carries. This part of the story is where this story arrives at its full weight. What justice delivered, what it could not deliver, and the lesson that outlives every name in this case. Texas law does not offer many gradations when the facts of a case arrive in the form that the facts of the Paton case arrived. The charge of capital murder of multiple persons is the instrument the Texas Penal Code reserves for the most extreme category of criminal homicide, the kind where the deliberateness, the multiplicity of victims, and the calculated nature of what occurred place the event outside the range that any lesser charge can adequately address. Capital murder of multiple persons means that the state has determined, based on the evidentiary record it has assembled, that a defendant intentionally caused the deaths of more than one person during the same criminal transaction. In Texas, this charge carries 2 possible outcomes at sentencing. The first is death. The second is life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. There is no middle ground. There is no version of this charge that allows for a sentence that permits, at any future point, the possibility of release. Whatever the court decides, it decides for the entirety of the defendant's remaining life. The decision to charge Michael Patrick Paton with capital murder of multiple persons was not a prosecutorial overreach. It was the legally accurate and factually supported response to a crime in which 3 members of the same household were shot and killed by the same person in the same sequence of events on the same night. 3 victims, 3 deliberate acts, 1 perpetrator. The charge named what the evidence established. The prosecutorial team that carried this case from the night of the murders to the moment of legal resolution deserves to be named, because the work of building accountability in a case like this one is not a mechanical process. It requires sustained effort, institutional coordination, and a commitment to the victims that extends across months and years without losing its precision. District Attorney Greg Willis oversaw the prosecution of the case. Assistant Criminal District Attorneys Cresta Garland and Dewey Mitchell represented the state in court. Collin County District Attorney's Office investigator Robin Lawfon, whose contribution to the evidentiary construction of the case ran across the full 21 months of the investigation, provided the investigative support that prosecutorial work of this scope required. Victim Assistance Coordinator Shawnette Bronson served the family of Tamara Jo Paton throughout the process, providing the human-facing dimension of accountability that victims' families require from the institutions handling their cases. These individuals, working within a system that demands evidence over assumption and proof over probability, carried the weight of 3 deaths through every stage of the legal process until that weight produced a result. What that result looked like, and what one particular decision made before it arrived changed about the story this case tells, is where this part of the narrative now moves. Before this story delivers the resolution, there is one detail about how that resolution arrived that most people who follow this case do not fully absorb. When they do absorb it, it changes something about how the entire preceding 21 months of legal process looks. Michael Patrick Paton pleaded guilty against the explicit advice of his own attorney. Paul Johnson, the defense lawyer appointed to represent Michael Paton, had counseled his client that proceeding to trial was the strategically sound choice. A trial carried the possibility of presenting mitigating circumstances. It carried the possibility of introducing evidence and argument that might, in some form, affect the outcome in ways that a straight guilty plea could not. It was, from a purely legal and strategic standpoint, the more defensible path for a defendant facing capital murder charges. Michael Paton overrode that advice. The man who had spent his entire adult life managing every narrative available to him, who had controlled what his neighborhood knew, what his community could see, how the 911 call framed what he had done, made one final unilateral decision. He chose to plead guilty. He chose to remove himself from the process through which his own defense would have been constructed and argued. He made the choice his attorney told him not to make, and he made it without deferring to the professional counsel retained for exactly that purpose. Now hold that fact and sit with this question. If the person who had taken everything from you, who had removed from your family the futures they were owed, then stood before a court and said that their decision to forego a defense was a sacrifice they were making for you, to spare you the additional pain of a public trial, how would you receive that? Could you receive it as genuine? Could a man capable of what Michael Paton did also be genuinely carrying the weight of what he had done? Could those two things coexist inside the same person? This story will not answer that for you. It will hold the question open and trust you to sit with it honestly, because the honest answer is not simple. And the cases that matter most are rarely the ones where the simple answer is available. What is clear is this: a man who controlled everything chose, at the end of everything, to control the story of his own conviction. Whether what motivated that choice was genuine anguish or one final act of narrative management is a question that only Michael Paton could answer. And whatever his answer would be, it would arrive from a man whose credibility had been consumed entirely by what he did on February 19th, 2021. What does justice look like when it finally arrives in a case like this one? Is a sentence the conclusion, or does this story carry something forward that no courtroom can fully contain? Those are the questions the rest of this story is built to address. Paul Johnson spoke publicly about his client in the period surrounding the guilty plea and sentencing. What he said was direct and consistent across his statements. He characterized Michael Paton as a man who feels horrible. He said that his client had always shown a lot of remorse. He described the guilty plea, made against his own legal advice, as an act his client insisted upon for reasons that had nothing to do with legal strategy and everything to do with the pain of the people his actions had produced. Paul Johnson was doing what defense attorneys are obligated to do. He was representing his client's interests, including his client's human interests, to the fullest extent the circumstances allowed. The circumstances did not allow for a defense of the facts. The facts were not in dispute. What remained available was the representation of Michael Paton as a human being capable of remorse, capable of a response to what he had done that went beyond self-preservation. Paul Johnson presented that representation as faithfully as the record permitted him to. The honest assessment of those statements requires holding two possibilities at the same time without forcing either one to collapse into the other. The first possibility is that Michael Paton did, in some genuine dimension of his interior experience, feel the full weight of what he had done. That somewhere inside the man who shot his wife in a closet and his 2 children in their own house, there was a capacity for reckoning that remained functional. That the guilty plea was, at least in part, a real response to a genuine awareness that Tamara Jo Paton's family had already suffered the maximum amount of damage one human family can be asked to absorb, and that a public trial requiring them to sit through the detailed reconstruction of how 3 people they loved were killed would have been an additional harm that he had the ability to prevent. The second possibility is that the guilty plea was the last available expression of the identity that had governed Michael Paton's entire adult life. That choosing to plead guilty against legal advice in a public way that his attorney would note and that the record would document was one final act of controlling the narrative, one final positioning of himself as the man making a deliberate and purposeful decision, even at the moment of his own legal reckoning, one final assertion that he was the person determining how the story of this event would be told. The honest position is that both possibilities are real, and that in the psychology of a man like Michael Paton, they were likely not distinguishable even to him. People do not always know which of their internal motivations is primary. The controlling personality and the experiencing of genuine remorse are not mutually exclusive states. They can occupy the same person at the same time, pulling in directions that are not fully legible even from the inside. What is not debatable is the practical outcome. Tamara Jo Paton's family did not have to sit through a capital murder trial. Whatever drove the decision, its effect was real, and it spared a family that had already been asked to bear more than any family should be asked to bear. On the morning of November 11th, 2002, 21 months and 22 days after the night Michael Paton stood in the yard of 3100 Hickory Lane with a gun in his hand. He stood before the Collin County Court. There was no jury. There were no closing arguments. There was no dramatic pivot in the final hours of a trial. No verdict read aloud in a packed room, while a family gripped each other's hands and waited. There was a man, 39 years old, confirming in the formal legal language of a Texas courtroom what he had already said in 7 words to a 911 dispatcher on a February night 2 years earlier. The court accepted the plea of guilty to capital murder of multiple persons. Sentencing proceeded. District Attorney Greg Willis made a statement following the sentencing that has remained in the record of this case. The most precise articulation of what Michael Paton actually did and what made it distinct from other categories of violence. He said that husbands and fathers should bravely protect their families, not use their special access to permanently eliminate them. 2 words in that statement carry the full weight of this case. Special access, not force, not superior strength, not a weapon he obtained from outside the household, or a plan constructed with outside assistance. Special access, the kind of access that only exists inside the most trusted relationship a human being can occupy. The access that comes with being the person a wife expects to be safe alongside. The access that comes with being the person children expect to be protected by. The access that does not require picking a lock or breaking a window, because it was never restricted in the first place. Because the people inside the house had no reason to restrict it, because they loved the person coming through the door. Michael Paton used that access as the instrument of 3 deaths. He did not force his way into the lives of Tamara Jo Paton, Kyndle Paton, and Evan Paton. He was already inside them. He had been inside them for years, occupying the position of the one person each of them had no reason to guard themselves against. And he used that position, that trust, that particular and irreplaceable intimacy. To do what a stranger with no relationship to the household could never have done with such completeness. That is what Greg Willis named. That is what the phrase special access contains. It is not a legal term. It is a moral description, stated plainly and without ornament, of the specific betrayal at the center of this case. And it is the phrase that will outlast every procedural detail of the prosecution, every courtroom date, every legal filing, because it names the thing that makes this case not simply a crime, but a fundamental violation of the most basic human trust. The court that accepted the guilty plea did not manufacture that violation. It simply named it, formally, and attached to the man responsible for it the consequence that consequence required. Michael Patrick Paton was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He was 39 years old. Life without parole, under Texas law, means exactly what it says. There is no review board. There is no future hearing at which new evidence of rehabilitation or changed circumstances can be introduced to support a case for release. There is no possibility, built anywhere into the structure of the sentence, that the man who shot Tamara Jo Paton, Kyndle Paton, and Evan Paton will return to the world in which those three people no longer exist. He will age inside a Texas correctional facility. Every year that passes for everyone who knew his victims, every year that their absence accumulates into a longer and longer gap in the lives of the people who loved them, will pass for Michael Paton inside a cell. He will die there. This is not a triumphant ending. It needs to be stated directly, without the false comfort of framing a life sentence as a form of healing or restoration. It is not. The accountability is real, complete, and permanent. The repair that accountability is sometimes assumed to produce is not available in this case, or in any case structured the way this one is. The sentence does not restore Tamara Jo Paton's future. It does not give Kyndle Paton the years she was owed. It does not give Evan Paton the person he was in the process of becoming. Those things are gone. A life sentence does not reach them. The question of why the death penalty was not the outcome in a case that carried the legal eligibility for it is answered by the prosecutorial logic that governed the resolution. A guilty plea accepted immediately delivered certain and permanent accountability on a defined timeline. A capital trial, pursued to its furthest legal conclusion and followed by the mandatory appellate process that Texas law requires after any death sentence, could have extended the legal proceedings by years, potentially by a decade or more. That extended timeline would have required the family of Tamara Jo Paton to remain inside the legal process, connected to the case, unable to access any form of finality for the duration. The decision to accept a life sentence in exchange for a guilty plea was made with the family's need for closure as a governing consideration. It was a strategic choice, a humane one, and one that delivered permanent accountability on the fastest possible timeline available. Michael Patrick Paton will never walk free. That is the irreducible core of the outcome, and whatever its limitations as a form of repair, it is as complete a legal consequence as the system can produce. This story opened with a question about control, about the person whose face has become so familiar that you have stopped truly examining it, about what lives behind the surfaces that people construct and maintain for the benefit of the world around them. It is time to bring that question to its full answer, because the answer that the arc of Michael Paton's life produces is not one that requires additional argument. It is simply true, and the truth of it is the most complete lesson this story contains. Michael Patrick Paton spent his entire adult life in the pursuit of one thing, not wealth, not prominence, not the kind of success that can be measured in titles or recognition. He pursued control, the control of what his neighborhood could see, the control of what his community was permitted to know about his household, the control of how the deterioration of his marriage was processed. which was entirely internally and entirely invisibly. The control of what Tamara Jo Paton knew about the state he was actually in. The control of the narrative he offered the 911 dispatcher, even as he was confessing to 3 murders. The control of the decision to plead guilty over the explicit advice of his own attorney. One final assertion that he was the person determining how the story of his actions would be recorded. From the first day he built a life in Celina, to the last word he spoke before a judge in Collin County, control was not a tool he used occasionally. It was the only architecture of identity he had ever constructed. He had no other self beneath the one built on management and performance, and the careful restriction of what others could access and verify about him. And here is what that architecture of control produced. 3 graves, a family permanently fractured by loss, a community permanently marked by the knowledge that the worst things can happen inside the houses that look most ordinary, and a life sentence in a Texas prison that removed permanently and without any future point of reconsideration every dimension of freedom and autonomy that Michael Paton had spent his entire life engineering the performance of having. He wanted control over his world. He lost control of everything. He could not tolerate the dissolution of his marriage, so he dissolved his family instead. He could not accept being seen as someone whose life had not held together the way he needed it to hold, so he guaranteed that his failure would be the most documented, most publicly verified, most permanent failure available to a human being. He managed everything with such relentless effort for so long, and the management produced the complete and total surrender of every freedom he'd been managing to protect. The man who managed everything surrendered everything. That is not a satisfying irony. There is no satisfaction available in this case. It is simply the truth of what controller's identity produces when the internal pressure it was always suppressing finally finds its way out. It is a lesson about what happens when a person chooses the performance of strength over the practice of honesty for long enough, and in a sealed enough environment, that the only direction left for what was never honestly addressed is outward. This story will not end on Michael Paton. It will end on the 3 people whose names should carry further and last longer than his. Tamara Jo Paton was 36 years old. She was the warmth at the center of a household that depended on her presence in ways that may never have been fully named while she was alive to receive that naming. She was a woman whose practical intelligence, whose genuine openness, whose specific and irreplaceable quality of being in the world had not reached anything close to its full expression by the time it was taken. She had decades ahead of her, relationships that would have deepened, a version of herself that was still in the process of becoming. She deserved every one of those years. She was denied all of them, in her own home, by the person she had built her life alongside. Kyndle Paton was 14. She was at the age where the first real outline of the adult she was becoming had started to come into focus. The interests that were beginning to define her, the friendships that carried the specific weight that teenage friendships carried, the developing sense of who she was and who she intended to be. Everything that 14 points toward, every year and every experience and every relationship that should have followed it, was taken from her in the house where she slept. Evan Paton was 13. He had barely begun. The world in front of him was still almost entirely unknown, and still almost entirely possible. He had done nothing except exist as a child in his father's house, and in the collapsed logic of what Michael Paton had become, that was the only thing required of him to become a target. 13 years old. Every year that should have come after 13 was removed from him by the only person who should have been most committed to protecting his access to those years. 3 people, 3 future, 3 human beings whose lives had value that no legal proceeding can quantify, no sentence can represent, and no passage of time will reduce. They were not symbols. They were not supporting characters in the story of what Michael Paton did. They were the story. They remain the story. Tamara Jo, Kyndle, Evan, those names are what this story was always carrying. The prevention of what happened at 3100 Hickory Lane on February 19, 2021, did not live in the courtroom that processed its aftermath. It did not live in the sentence. The courtroom and the sentence arrived after the three people who most needed prevention had already been taken. Justice, in that context, is the most that the system can offer. It is not early enough to be prevented. It is only ever accountability. Prevention lives somewhere else entirely. It lives in the connections that are built before a household becomes a sealed system. It lives in communities willing to remain genuinely present to the people living around them, willing to invest in the accumulated familiarity that converts proximity into genuine knowledge, willing to notice when something about a household has changed, and willing to have the kind of relationship with that household that makes the noticing actionable. It lives in a cultural willingness to tell men the truth, that a life organized entirely around the performance of strength, around the management of what others are permitted to see of your interior, around the refusal to acknowledge failure, or seek help, or allow yourself to be genuinely known by the people around you, is not strength. It is the most dangerous kind of fragility. It is the kind of fragility that, sealed in the right environment and left without interruption for long enough, can reach the place that Michael Paton reached, the asking for help that Michael Paton never did, the reaching outward that the isolation he had built made structurally unavailable, the honest acknowledgement of a life that was not holding together the way he needed it to hold, was not weakness. It was the only thing that had any chance of producing a different outcome. And it was the one thing the architecture of his identity made completely impossible. This story asks you to think about the households around you that you have not looked closely at in a while, the people in your community who project stability without ever quite confirming it. The men in your life who carry everything visibly and share nothing honestly. It asks you to notice before the phone call, because the phone call, when it comes, always comes too late. Tamara Jo, Kyndle, Evan. What will we do differently before the call that comes too late? This story has reached its end, but the conversation it opens does not have to. The first thing I am asking you to do is share this video with someone in your life right now, not as a favor to this channel, because someone in your world might hear what Tamara Jo Paton's story reveals and recognize something they have not yet been able to name in their own community, their own family, or their own experience. One share could put this story in front of the person who needed it most. The second thing I am asking is that you leave a real comment below, not a single word this time, a real answer to a real question. What do you believe should be taught in schools and in communities about the warning signs of isolation, controlled households, and private crises? What does this story make you want to change about how you show up for the people around you? Write it out. This community deserves that conversation. And the third thing, if you have made it to the end of this story, and it has done what a story like this is supposed to do, subscribe to Bedtime Black File Stories and turn on your notifications. Every case on this channel is told with the seriousness the real people inside it deserve. Every story is chosen because it carries a lesson worth staying awake for. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening all the way to the end. Tamara Jo, Kyndle, Evan. Their names deserved to be said, and now they have been. Good night. See you on the next one.